Hello, welcome to a lecture on the Rose Industrial Revolution, and in this lecture we are going to look at the corporate models that developed and these giant corporations in the oil industry and the steel industry and then in other industries as well. And so we're starting off just a reminder that it's because of the mechanization and the machinery that we're allowed to are able to have such high volumes of productivity, but there's also a huge consumer market that's available, and with the labor supply as well. And all of these are really just combining to create, by 1900, the United States as the world's leading industrialized nation. They started behind Great Britain, but both the United States in 1865 at the end of the Civil War and Germany coming together as a single unified country on the same time, both started to catch up quite rapidly and both surpassed Great Britain in industrial capacity and in productivity. Now, if we look at the before, you would have factories, but it might look something like this, and we can see there's a few things to notice out of this. First off, there are no machines. These gentlemen here are making cigars, and a few women in there as well, I believe. So no machines, and if you notice the guy up at the front, what's he doing? He's reading the newspaper. They would choose a different person, every few hours to be a reader, and he would read the newspaper or from a popular magazine or a story to entertain the workers as the day went by. So it wasn't so drudgery as you work. But with machines, you could no longer do this. It just won't work. And the reason is because the machines are just so noisy. You wouldn't be able to do something like this. And with new sort of attitudes from the business bosses, they wouldn't accept this either, because that one person, this guy up here, he is not working, and so he's not as efficient. And so these kind of little perks will disappear. Also, something that used to happen before is they would have sort of what they called the Blue Monday, which is Monday morning. You sort of ease your way back into work. It's not like 8:30 Monday morning, boom, you're working. You would relax as you sort of came in and start the day off or the week off on an easy note. So that's ending with the mechanization. And there was a very strong incentive to mass produce and to mechanize production, because you could produce so much bigger, faster for this bigger market. And because of this large consumer market, the easily produced with the transportation is good money. But with machines, you can replace expensive skilled labor with cheap unskilled labor. It's called the division of labor. You break the working down into its constituent parts. And so you have a person who's just doing the same thing over and over again. It's very easy to train that person. He doesn't need a skill that takes years and years of apprenticeship to learn. And so with mechanization, you can tap into that unskilled labor market. And the immigrants and blacks and others, and labor be very, very cheap. This is the time of lots of new inventions, and we see here some of the ones coming out of the Gilded Age. The top right, that is a refrigerated train, so you can transport food across greater distances. The dynamo is in the bottom right, which is a machine that can create electricity, the telephone and the typewriter coming in. And these kinds of inventions, the typewriter and the telephone, allow the corporations to be so much more organized and larger and efficient, and to be able to operate over larger areas. And the greatest inventor of them all during this time period is Thomas Alva Edison. All right, you see there. And he didn't really come up necessarily with inventions, but with the research lab and bringing together lots of smart people into a research lab, much like something like Google or IBM today, that kind of a model. His was in New Jersey. All right, moving on though to the big three in terms of the business community in this time: Andrew Carnegie in steel, John D. Rockefeller in oil, and J.P. Morgan, an investment banker. And you can see there, if we took the wealth that they earned in their lifetime and converted it into today's dollars, you can see the value that these two gentlemen achieved. John D. Rockefeller is certainly the richest businessman of all time. Now, it's very hard to compare the riches of all time across time periods, but in the modern sense, the richest person of all time. Now, steel, which is Andrew Carnegie's going to dominate this market, it before could not be produced in large quantities. There just wasn't a process to doing it. So steel used to be just for things like razors or swords, and because it was very expensive to produce and very difficult to produce in a large scale. But they're going from cast iron to wrought iron to steel. And the advantages of steel is that it's just so much stronger, and iron is strong too, but iron can break and snap easily, so you can't use it to build, say, a tall skyscraper. The weight is just going to crush it, but steel can hold up with that, so just so much better. And we've got a new process to making it. It comes around by accident, the Bessemer process in the 1850s, and discovery that if you took molten iron, and you infused it with oxygen, just sort of like a big burp, that it would create this massive reaction, which you're seeing there. And what's coming off of the iron is all of the impurities, lots of different chemicals are coming off, and you're left with steel. And in this process, you can produce it in much larger quantities in the steel mills. Now, Andrew Carnegie, how did he do so well? He was really the first to do what's known as vertical integration within your business, where he took the resources, he owned them, he owned large coal mines, he owned the transportation networks that he was moving it on, and he had the steel mills. So before, when he first started out, he had a steel mill, but he would have to purchase coal from another company, and then he would have to pay another company to help ship it to his steel mill, and then he would have to pay the transportation to ship it to market. Well, now he's got all three of them, and in this way he could outcompete in his competitors and become the dominant person within the industry. John D. Rockefeller was more of the horizontal integration, where you purchase up sort of all of your competitors. And so these are oil refineries where you take in the crude raw oil from the ground and through different chemical processes, turning it into products. And so buying up the smaller ones into just sort of a monopoly corporation. Which gets to this, what we're known as trusts. We might call it a monopoly or a holding company, where you would have the super company. And that super company would own stocks in other companies that are called holding companies, because all these holding companies do is hold stock in corporations. And you can see they're owning enough of the voting stock. So the public sees, okay, in the oil market, we have Corporation A, and I can go to Company A, Company B, Company C. And of course, consumers, if they're not happy with one company, its price or its customer service, you can always say, go to the competitor. And it seems like there's competition, but in fact there is no competition, because these corporations that look like they're operating as individually are actually being controlled by the super holding company, which is the one that determines policy. And this is sort of what would happen with John D. Rockefeller and his Standard Oil Company. Standard Oil Company is the super holding company, and we get our trusts. And J.P. Morgan, he was very good at sort of managing these trusts, and the people in the board of directors in all of these companies, often they're sort of his people. And as an investment banker, he's doing a lot of the purchasing of the stock and the owning of the stock, and then managing these sort of large trusts. And he would end up buying out Andrew Carnegie's steel company outright for, I believe, about $500 million. And Andrew Carnegie sold it to J.P. Morgan, and it became U.S. Steel, one of the largest companies in the United States. So Rockefeller, for him, it was the kerosene industry. Kerosene is used for lighting, and it became a very good fuel for lighting. And he was ruthlessly trying to destroy his competition and remove any sort of middlemen from it, and seeking to monopolize the refinery aspect of the industry, not about producing oil out of the ground or anything like that. He wants to be the only refiner within the industry. Used a lot of dubious methods, and the most important one is he made a deal with railroad companies, a secret deal, where he would get a cheaper price to ship. In return, he would guarantee a large amount of volume. And so he could then outcompete his competitors and sell cheaper than them, force them out of business, and then just buy them up, and buying up all of the refineries. And by 1890, he has 95% of oil refining in the United States, right around the time when cars started to becoming using gasoline and needing engine oil. So these are monopolies. And what's the problem with monopolies? Now, the price of Standard Oil's product actually dropped once he came to dominate the market. And you think, well, why not? Why doesn't he raise the price if he's the only person around? Well, it's not that he wants to sell at the highest price. He wants to make the most money. And so a lower price equals a greater demand, which is going to lead to greater sales, and then for him a greater profit. If he had too high of a price, then demand would come down and he wouldn't make as much money. So he's making more money off of having a lower price. And he would argue that, it's good to have a monopoly because I can provide the product very efficiently and at a very good price. But the problems with monopolies is they're very risk averse, so they're not going to try to innovate or change or improve, which you will get through real competition. If you have real competition, you want to get out there the best product that you can. And you don't need to worry about customer service because you are the only provider in town, and so they tend to get very bad customer service when you get monopolies. This is the image of him and his Standard Oil Company. And this famous one where he's looking in at Congress going, what a funny little government in there. And he really has become beyond the government in terms of power. And another one of the people, the workers, having to hold up the bosses and the bosses of the Senate. And they were very much protected by government laissez-faire, saying this is just natural order. If you're going to get competition, eventually you're going to get a survivor of the fittest, that social Darwinist idea. And for many, they were not seen as evil or unscrupulous. They were seen as shrewd, wise businessmen, or they would be called captains of industry. Their critics called them the robber barons. Now, government will sort of take them on, but like the ICC, it's not really going to be enforced properly, and it doesn't really have a lot of teeth to it, the Sherman Antitrust Act, which forbid combinations of businesses to operate in what they called restraint of trade, and it was never really vigorously used. Ironically, it was used not to attack businesses, but unions in this way. And so the United States as an industrialized nation, we can see much of the industries happening up in the Northeast, and especially into the sort of what really grew up is this industrial area here. Pittsburgh is where a steel town, their football team is called the Steelers, and in Ohio and up into Michigan and these areas here, that's the big manufacturing belt going on here. Whereas other places, it's more about the resources over there, not so much industry. So what does it all mean? There's great wealth being created. Despite, the downtimes sort of in the 1870s and 1890s, there is a lot of wealth being created. But a lot of there's also a lot more wealth inequality with like a super rich and a lot of people sort of in the working class. But there's also a much larger middle class as well. And the idea of conspicuous consumption, you consume and shop to show off, and a showing off of a lot of that wealth. We get an example here. And it very much accentuated class differences, which is sort of a new thing that, because Americans have always tried to think of themselves as not being a class society, as in the idea of like the feudal peasants of Europe and aristocrats kind of classes. But because of the inequality of wealth, it is sort of, people are identifying a little bit more as belonging to a class. And there's opportunity for all despite these boom and bust cycles. And for one group in particular, for women, there were opportunities in this new industrial world, in a large part as office clerks or running the telephones or as stenographers or typists and secretaries as well. And there was in the cities a new sort of fashion and sort of the ideal of the woman, sometimes known as the Gibson girls, and getting away from those Victorian era sort of restraints on women, and them trying to just assert themselves a little bit more independently, particularly in the cities and among the middle class girls. All right, that's where we're going to stop. There's your tycoons and Rockefeller and your Carnegies and your others. Okay, thank you very much for listening.